Hey, what's up? I got some more lore content for you guys. My name is Tempo. I've been playing and making content for Riot's card game since its closed beta, specializing in beginner content to help you get into the game, along with peaking rank 1 multiple times on ladder, and I will be your gameplay guide to Legends of Runeterra. This video will be aimed at completely new players to Legends of Runeterra. I want to break down the flow of a match, explain basic mechanics, why this game is unique, and help you get a jumpstart on other new players, or to better equip you to take on the Path of Champions PvE game mode. Shout out to Captain Sarah for helping me with this video. With that, let's get into it. Since lore is a card game, you will be taking turns against your opponent by playing cards, and attacking and defending until one of you drops to 0 HP, one of you surrenders, or in some niche cases, when one person resolves a card with its own win condition, or someone runs out of cards to draw on their deck. The first thing that I want to touch on, and something you'll see immediately upon playing the tutorial, is that lore is a unique turn-based game, as both players get to play on each turn by passing actions back and forth. Every time you take an action to play a card, the opponent gets an action as well to play one of their own. This back and forth continues until both players are out of playable options, or both decide to full pass onto the next turn. Also on each turn, one player is on attack, while the other is on defense, meaning the attacker has to initiate combat, while the defender has to do just that, set up a defense and get ready for the attack. You can tell which player is on the attack turn by the glowing sword on the right side of the screen. This icon is called the attack token, and will come up later in the video. Now that we talked about a couple core mechanics of the game, let's start talking about cards themselves, with the most common ones that you'll see, and those are follower cards. You will fill your deck with a bunch of these, and they have various stats and effects that make them strong independently, or synergistic with other followers, and even champions with the same effects. Let's look at one of the most basic cards in the game, Bull Elnuk, for example. The top left is the mana required to play the follower. You start the game with 1 mana, and each turn both players receive an additional 1, up to 10 total unit mana to play with, meaning you will naturally be able to play Bull Elnuk on turn 4. The big numbers on the bottom are the card's attack and health points, attack being on the left, and HP being on the right. These are the numbers that will be used to damage each other's cards, and also Nex's health. The icon on the top right denotes the region or regions that the card belongs to. For basic deck building, you are allowed to build decks with up to 2 regions. Of course, there are cool cards that bypass this, but keeping it basic, you'll be using 2 regions for your decks as a new player. Deck building is its own beast that I've already covered, so check out my full deck building guide if you're interested in crafting your own decks from scratch and how to navigate the crafting menus. After that, the last thing on Bull Elnuk is the tag at the top. That is a tribal tag. Some cards will have bonus effects that work with cards that have certain tags, and sometimes there are whole archetypes surrounding the tags, like elites and lurk. If your follower has any bonus effects or keywords, they will appear below the name of the card. The next most common cards you'll see and fill your deck with are spells. Just like followers, spells cost mana to play, and also just like followers, the mana required is at the top left. I'll take a quick moment to talk about another really cool aspect of lore that makes the game unique, and that is the spell mana mechanic. Basically how it works is if you pass your turn with playable mana remaining, you can bank up to 3 of it for future turns. This mana can only be used to cast spells, and also attach weapon equipments, but that's for later. And it's really handy because then you have mana to play some cheap spells alongside your followers in the future, or you can actually use this mana to cast spells on earlier turns than normal. For example, if you pass turn 3 and save all of it as spell mana, you may then cast a 7 cost spell on the following turn, since you will have 4 mana for the turn, on top of the 3 spell mana that you just saved. So spellcasting decks have a lot more versatility in how you manage your resources and mana. The next icon to talk about is the shoe under the mana cost, and also in the text box of the card. That is the speed at which the spell is played. Currently in lore, there are 4 spell speeds: slow, fast, burst, and focus. I know it might seem like a lot, but trust me, it's actually very simple. I'll break down each speed one at a time. Slow speed spells are played during your turn action, and it takes your entire action to cast one, meaning it's the same speed as playing a follower. Your opponent will get to play something immediately after you resolve your slow spell. You cannot play slow spells during combat, so if units are in the middle of attacking and defending, you cannot use a slow spell to swing the combat in your favor. Finally, slow speed spells also create a spell stack, meaning the opponent can react to your slow speed spell with a fast or burst one of their own in order to counter yours. Think of it like a Yu-Gi-Oh chain. Also in the same way, multiple spells can go up on the stack, up to 9, for these really long sequences. All the effects will resolve backwards, meaning the last spell played will happen first, and continue working itself backwards until the spell stack fully resolves. Only slow speed spells, fast speed spells, and unit skills go on the stack. Quick side note, unit skills are additional effects that occur when a condition is met, like playing a card from hand or attacking, and it basically functions as an automatically casted fast speed spell, which is the next thing we're going to be talking about. Fast speed spells are similar to slow ones in that if you cast it during your action, it will pass priority to the opponent. But the main differences are that fast speed spells can be played as a reaction to enemy spells or skills, and can also be used during combat. These are primarily going to be reactive, like spells that deal damage, but also allows the opponent the opportunity to give their units extra HP to survive said damage. Moving on to burst speed spells, this is the strongest speed because they can do everything. If you cast one during your action, it does not pass the turn priority, meaning you can do another action after casting a burst speed spell. You may even cast as many burst spells as you'd like in a sequence, and your opponent will never have the ability to react or play their own cards. Finally, we have focus speed spells. They're the same as burst speed in terms of pass priority. You can cast a bunch of them and immediately do something else like going into combat for your next action, but you cannot use focus speed during combat or as a reaction to an opponent's action. Here are some last quick side notes about spells while we're talking about them. If your spell can't resolve because the unit died at some point during the spell stack, then your spell does something called fizzling out, which means the primary and often secondary effects don't resolve. Let's take a look at Glare as a card. If you try to glare an enemy unit and they sacrifice it with a spell of their own, your target is lost, and Glare will fizzle, which means the second part of the effect to draw a card will also be negated. This is because of the word to. You need to resolve the first part of the card to get the second effect. Some cards will not have this happen, however, like Pokestick. If there is a period or the word and, you don't have to worry about the second effect fizzling out, so it's something to keep in mind. Next we have the card type that everyone's eager to play around, and that is the Champion card. Champions are oftentimes the cornerstone of the deck, and give you either a direction for deck building, winning the game, or both. Champions are the main characters of Legends of Runeterra, which makes sense because they are the faces of League of Legends. Upon achieving the level up condition, champions grow in stats and sometimes give you bonuses to help you win the game. They also have this really neat mechanic where if you have a champion in play, extra copies of it in your hand become their spell form, allowing you to cast a spell and put the champion back in your deck to draw them later. Most champion spells are also regular spells that you can add to your deck, so you basically get extra copies of certain cards, which is something to think about during deck building. There are cards that differentiate between followers and units. The big difference is the inclusion of champions for set effects. For example, a card like Void Seeker that says it will do damage to followers specifically means it won't be able to target champions, whereas Deathray MK1 says it will deal damage to a unit. This opens up the ability to hit champions because champs are not followers, they are their own card type under the unit umbrella. And there are also cards like Soul Harvest that make it really easy to see the differentiation. Landmarks are next on the list. So these cards are actually very simple. You pay unit mana to put them on the board, and they have a variety of effects that range from drawing cards to winning the game outright. There are also story landmarks that have an active effect that you can use once per turn. For example, you can use Family Reunion's slow speed gloom effect on the turn that you play it, and then next turn use the impact one. And finally, on the third use, boost 2 units and then the landmark destroys itself. Story effects have to be played in ascending order, and you can choose to pass one turn and leave it there for longer, but you cannot use the same act effect multiple times on the same landmark. Some story effects are different spell speeds, so make sure to check the speed icon when using them. There are also cards in the game that can destroy landmarks, so watch out for those or use them to your advantage. And finally, for card types, we have equipment. These are basically weapons that you equip to your units for additional stats, effects, and or keywords to make them stronger. What's cool about equipment is that you can use spell mana to attach it to your cards. Just like with landmarks, there are certain cards that can destroy equipment specifically. This portion of the video will be dedicated to keywords, what they look like, and how they function. There are positive keywords and negative keywords. Positive keywords are buffs to your cards that make them stronger, and negative keywords are nerfs that make cards weaker. Let's start with Overwhelm. A unit with Overwhelm will deal excess damage through its blocker directly to the enemy nexus. Usually if a block happens, the defender takes no nexus damage, but if a 4-attack Overwhelm unit is blocked by a 1 HP unit, the difference is subtracted and applied to the defender's nexus. So that would be 3 direct damage. Overwhelm units will also hit the opponent directly if the blocker is removed from combat anytime after the block has been determined. So if you use a kill spell on a blocker, your Overwhelm unit will still hit the opponent directly as if a blocker was never there to begin with. Units with Augment gain +1 attack whenever they see you play a created card, so one that is generated and did not start in your deck. Units with Barrier have a 1-turn damage shield. It will block the next instance of any amount of damage taken. The barrier lasts until the turn ends and then it goes away. It cannot stack, it does not protect from Overwhelm piercing damage, but it does prevent lifesteal and drain spells from giving the opponent Nexus health. Brash units cannot be blocked by enemies that have less than 3 health. Fearsome units cannot be blocked by enemies that have less than 3 attack. Challenger units can choose which unit blocks them, taking the option away from the opponent. Units with Deathless resurrect with 1 health after dying for the first time. Deathless is then removed from the card. Deep is both a keyword and an archetype. Units with Deep gain +3/+3 when you have 15 or fewer cards in your own deck. Cards that generate random keywords cannot generate Deep. All future keywords that are not generatable will have not generatable on screen, so I don't have to say it every time. Quick attack units strike first when attacking. If the blocker dies before it can strike back, the attacking unit with quick attack will not take any damage back. If the blocker survives, however, then the quick attack unit will take damage as normal. Double attack is like super quick attack. It strikes first, just like quick attack does, and then strikes again. If there is no blocker, then the unit will simply hit the enemy directly twice. Elusive units can only be blocked by other elusive units, or units with the Sharp Sight keyword. Sharp Sight units can block elusive units. Evolve units gain +2/+2 once you've played 6 or more unique positive keywords on any of your units over the course of the game. Faded units gain +1/+1 each turn that they are targeted by an allied card, whether in hand or an effect on the board. As long as it targets, the faded unit will gain +1/+1. The buff can stack forever, but it is only applied once per turn. Formidable units strike with their health instead of their attack. Units with Fury gain +1/+1 whenever they successfully kill an enemy unit, whether through combat or the resolution of a strike spell. Hallowed works in 2 parts. If a Hallow unit dies, you get a ramping stack. When allies attack, your leftmost attacker gets +1 attack for each Hallowed unit that died over the course of the game. You can check your Hallowed stacks by clicking or tapping on your deck. Units with Impact will deal an additional 1 direct damage to the enemy nexus on successful attack strike. Impact damage will not apply on defense, and it will not apply if the enemy blocker goes missing from the combat via a kill spell. When a unit with lifesteal strikes, the ally nexus will gain health equal to the lifesteal unit's attack stat. Lurk, a lot like Deep, is a keyword and an archetype at the same time. When you attack with anything, if you have a Lurk unit on top of your deck, all of your Lurker allies will gain a permanent +1 attack for the rest of the game. You can only trigger Lurk once per round. Units with regeneration will heal to their max health at round end. Scout is a very powerful keyword and also an archetype. When you attack with only Scout units, you gain an additional attack token for the round, allowing you to attack twice in the same turn. You want to attack with only Scouts first, and then you can attack with everything afterwards. You can only get a Scout attack once per turn, but if you use a Rally card, which also readies your attack, you can attack up to 3 times on your turn, or even twice on your opponent's turn. The Scout attack token has a unique visual effect to know that it's your free one. Spell Shield negates the next enemy spell or skill that would affect the unit. It doesn't stack and only protects from one spell instance, so spells that proc multiple times will still affect the unit once the spell shield is depleted, whereas one spell with one sequence, like Concerted Strike, will get the entire spell eaten. Units with Attune give you 1 spell mana for free when they're summoned. Spirit is a +1/+1 bonus that can be further increased by cards that say Boost. And finally, for positive keywords, we have Tough. Units with Tough take 1 less damage from any and all sources. Small side note is that Tough will not apply to Barrier, so a 1 damage spell will still ping off the barrier even though it would normally do 0 damage to the unit due to having Tough. Moving on to negative keywords. Can't block is simple. You can't declare the unit as a blocker, but they can still be grabbed by Challenger or pulled if they are vulnerable. Immobile units can't block or attack, but just like can't block, they can still be grabbed by Challenger or pulled if they are vulnerable. Vulnerable means that the unit can be dragged into combat by any of the opponent's attackers. It's as if everything on the enemy board has Challenger against your vulnerable unit. Ephemeral units die when they strike or when the round ends. Fleeting cards are discarded from your hand at round end if you don't play them. Frostbitten cards have their attack stat temporarily set to 0 until the end of the round. You can still buff the card after it's been frostbitten. Silenced units have all their keywords, abilities, positive and negative effects removed, including stat buffs. Stunned units are removed from combat and they can't declare attacks or blocks. Stunned units can still attack or block via spells that force units into combat, and can be grabbed or vulnerable pulled just like the immobile units. Stun goes away during round end. Captured units are removed from play until the card that captured them leaves the board. Then you get your unit back. The captured unit will trigger on-summon effects when brought back and removes debuffs and damage that it had before. It's like a full reset. Cursed units have a negative effect while you have the corresponding curse card in your hand. You may spend mana to play the curse and remove the negative effects from your cards. Gloom, which is like the opposite of Spirit, is a -1/-1 that can also be further increased by cards that say Boost. There are other effects that cards have that are not keywords. I'm not going to go over super self-explanatory concepts like Nexus Strike because that's just when your unit strikes the enemy nexus. Super simple, so some things will not be included in this section. Starting with Attach. Attach units can be played using unit mana as an attachment to another unit, sharing stats and keywords. When the unit leaves play, the attach unit goes back to hand. A unit can only have 1 attach or equipment at a time. Daybreak cards give you a bonus if they're the first card you play in a round. Nightfall cards give you a bonus if they're not the first card you play in a round. Enlighten cards have an effect if you have 10 max mana. Flow cards do something if you played at least 2 spells or skills in the previous round. Last Breath units do something when they die. Plunder cards get a bonus if you've damaged the enemy nexus in the round before playing the Plunder card. Reputation activates when your allies have struck for 5+ damage at least 4 separate times during the game. Support units buff the next unit attacking after them in the attack chain. Ambush units can be played as a 2/2 bush that hides the actual card. The opponent sees a bush, but it could actually be one of 7 different cards being played. The person playing the bush gets an ambush card that can be played at burst speed to summon the unit out to get bonus effects. Invoke cards show you 3 randomly selected cards from a pool of Celestials. You get to pick one of them and add it to your hand. The options shown to you are determined by the card doing the invoking, and you can see the full pool of options in the main menu under Collection, Cards, Slider button, and scroll down to the Celestial checkbox. Manifest creates in hand one of 3 randomly selected cards. The options shown to you are determined by the card doing the manifesting. Obliterate as a mechanic removes a unit from the game completely. It also doesn't trigger Last Breath on the unit being obliterated, and they can't be resummoned via revival effects. Cards that plant traps, like Puff Caps and Flash Bombs, are shuffled into the opponent's deck and trigger when they are drawn. Boons are similar, in which they are shuffled into your own deck and also trigger when drawn. Predict cards show you 3 cards from your deck, you pick one of them to put on top of your deck, and you put the remaining cards back where they were. Predicting does not shuffle your deck, and you can right-click to inspect the card if it has any traps or boons on it. Cards that recall put units back in the hand and remove all effects applied to it, basically resetting the card. Units that get slept by another card turn into a landmark and are resummoned when the countdown ends, replaying any on-summon effects. Updraft cards shuffle a specified number of cards from your hand into your deck to draw another specified number of cards. The card being updrafted will also receive a 1 mana discount, making it cheaper the next time you draw into it. Behold effects activate if you have a card that is required to be beholded in play or in the hand, and Titanic allies are allies that have a stat point of 8 or more in either attack or health. With all those little details out of the way, let's focus on the gameplay UI, things you're going to be doing in a match, and also the tools you have access to in order to understand and play each and every game of lore. The first thing you'll come across is the Mulligan phase. This is where you're allowed to replace some, none, or all of your cards in an attempt to draw different ones, increasing the consistency of your opening hand. Mulliganing is a crucial part of the game because you can get rid of late game cards in favor of more cheap ones, so you have something to play in the first few turns. Some decks require specific mulligan strategies, but it's mainly a skill that you pick up over time with experience and game knowledge. Before any cards are played, you can also see which player is attacking first, by the attack token appearing on the right side of the screen. If you have the attack token on the first turn, that means you'll be attacking on odd numbered turns this game. Turns 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on. Whereas if you don't have the attack token on turn 1, then you'll be attacking on even number turns, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. This is important especially for champions that want to attack on the turn they're summoned. For example, Shyvana and Gwen are a lot better when you're attacking on evens compared to odds. With those observations out of the way, there are a few things you can do and click on during each turn. So you can put playable units from your hand onto your board if you have the necessary amount of mana, you can cast spells and pick targets for said spells, or send units into combat if you're on attack turn. Combat always takes place in the middle of the board, above the bench, so it's important to learn the positional difference between a unit just in play versus a unit in combat. Another really important tool that you should get used to using is inspecting your and also your opponent's cards. On PC, right-click, and on mobile, simply tap the card to reveal its stats. You can also take a glance at keywords and what they do. If you're playing in Path of Champions or versus AI, you can take as long as you need. There is no turn timer. So please feel free to read the cards and get a general understanding of what things do. You can also use this menu to see the base stats of a card if it's been buffed so much and you don't remember what it used to look like. This is really good for determining if you should silence a unit or not. You can also look at the full art and flavor text of cards from this menu. The next tool to utilize is the Blue Eye of Prophecy. I don't know what it's actually called, but I've always just called it the Eye, which is incredibly ominous, but what it does is it shows you the outcome of the chain of events currently taking place. So if you initiate combat, determine block targets, or cast spells, you can hover the eye to see what everything will look like when it resolves. However, the eye will not be able to tell you the outcome of random effects, so if anything random is coming into play, the eye will not work. Also, pressing the resolve button just confirms that you're satisfied with what you're doing. It commits the play being done. It also turns into the end turn button when you have nothing else to do, or if you want to pass your turn early. Finally, the last icon over here is the history scroll. If you click on this, you can see the game's history, what cards were played, what cards died, and what turn each thing happened on. Really important for tracking certain cards too, especially tossed cards if deep is being played. So moving on to combat, which is arguably the most important part of each game, and from my experience is also the hardest part for new players to get a proper early understanding on. So let's talk about it from the attacker's point of view. You can send any number of your available units into attack, and you can also attack with them the first turn they're summoned. They do not have summoning sickness like in Hearthstone or Magic. They can attack right away. Once you've figured out which ones are going in, you should go ahead and hit commit. This will then give the opponent the ability to block accordingly. Once they hit commit, you get another action to use spells. At this point, no new attackers can go up, and no new blockers can be put up either. Everything is locked in. But again, you can use spells to buff your allies, or damage your opponents, and then they will be able to do the same if you use one. Combat uses the same passing system as the rest of the game. Every time you do something, the opponent will get a chance and vice versa. This is where you can use cards called combat tricks. These are cards that trick the enemy by making them play into your hand, like a gotcha kind of moment. You blocked my 2/2 with your 2/4, but I have a +2/+2 spell, so my card wins and still lives. Combat tricks are buff cards that are usually burst speed and serve this purpose. There's also stat reduction cards too, like Frostbite, that count as combat tricks, but the general point of them is to specifically help you win combat. The biggest mistake I see new players do is try to cast a spell at the same time as calling an attack, which then passes priority and allows the enemy to block with the unit being targeted by your spell. This is really, really bad. In general, you either want to play the spell first, or wait until after the block targets are determined. Some other small things to keep in mind is that sometimes the attack order matters. Two good examples of this would be support units needing to attack first, and the supported unit to the right of them, and also something like Darius, who wants to attack on the far right just in general, in case he levels up during combat to deal extra damage. Block order matters too, by the way, especially when considering lifesteal. If the opponent blocks with a lifesteal unit as their first blocker while at full health, they will get no heal value. But if they block later down the chain, they will get HP back. So that's something to think about as well. Things always go from left to right, and that's basically the standard flow of combat. I have some final things that I want to touch on in this section while we're still in game. There are cards that say give stats and cards that say grant stats. Grant is a permanent buff, while give is only for that turn. If a card says play X amount of new cards, that means unique cards played over the course of the game. The only way to get on-play effects is to play the card directly from hand. If it's summoned out another way like Revival, you will not get on-play effects, but you will still get on-summon effects. On-summon just means the card hits the board. It can be from anything or anywhere. The hand limit for the game is 10. Once you overdraw, you will burn cards, which for all intents and purposes is an obliteration effect. The cards lost in this way cannot be revived. They're removed from play entirely. Cards that copy another will create a copy of the original version of the card being chosen, while exact copy means an exact clone of the card upon resolution of the copy effect, meaning it will summon one with buffs if the original is buffed. For certain cards like Sunburst, there is an order of operations that you should be mindful of. Let's say you daybreak the card by playing it first in the round, and you are targeting a 6 HP unit. Your opponent then attempts to buff their card with a spell. Sunburst will then silence the unit, removing the buffs, and then will deal the 6 damage after, making the opponent's spell useless. They will only win the interaction if you don't daybreak the effect to get the silence on top of it. Some players might think the silence would happen first, then the buff, then the damage, but it's not like that, it's a 2-for-1 deal. A lot of cards have this order of operations and also multi-layered effects. So there's this mechanic called Deny, which is basically counterspell, stopping the opponent from being able to cast things at slow or fast speed, and also skills. There are only a few regions that have access to this mechanic, and they're aptly named the Deny regions. The main one is Ionia, the second one is Shurima, and the third is technically Bandle City, but this card is the least played of the bunch. Okay, so moving on to something I touched on earlier in the video, and that is the 2 regions for deck building. Well, there are these certain champions that basically are their own regions. They're called Runeterran Champs. Putting one in your deck automatically makes one of your regions their face. This is because they have their own deck building restrictions to make you include certain cards, but those cards can be from a bunch of different regions. For example, Kayn allows you to put cultist cards from everywhere into your deck. So make sure if you see this symbol by your favorite champion, you take a look at what needs to be crafted and included in the deck to support them. They're definitely for more experienced players to deck build with, so keep that in mind as well. And that's it for this gameplay guide. Extra shout out to the patrons on screen. Much love and thank you for supporting, with an extra hell yeah to Verdobe, who subscribed to the highest Patreon tier. Make sure to like and subscribe if this video helped at all. It really means a lot and shows the video to more people, so hopefully it can be seen by other beginners that need it. Feel free to check out my recent beginner guide and tips and tricks video for min-maxing resources and what you should do outside of the battles in order to get cards as quickly as possible. I'll also be posting more beginner videos along with meta deck updates soon, so you don't want to miss out. Also, come check me out on Twitch. I stream regularly, so come by and say hi. Thank you so much for watching and have a good one. Laters.